back. Thanks for sticking with us. It's Friday afternoon here on the Green Brush Show on Pro Cannabis Media. We're kind of jump usually from about 4:26 or so when we're done with the break till 4:30. We just fill in, but this is such an exciting topic. We're bringing in the 4:30 panelists now. We're very happy to have with us Stephen Hoffman, who's the chairman of the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission, and Scott Moskol, who co-leads the cannabis practice at Burns and Levinson, one of the leading law firms in the Boston area. So I'm going to give them a moment just to introduce themselves, and then we're going to get back into it with Professor Mikos. Stephen, you want to start?
Sure. I think you've already introduced me, David, but thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm Steve Hoffman. I'm the chairman of the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission. I've been in my job since September 1st of 2017, and it's been quite a ride to see how much we've accomplished over the last 4 years. There are now 317 operational marijuana establishments in the state, including over 150 retailers. We will, in calendar year 21, do approximately $1.3 billion of business, retail business in the adult use space. So the industry is taking off in Massachusetts. I think we still have a long ways to go, and we're excited about the future. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Great, and thank you as well for allowing me to join this group. My name is Scott Moskol. Like David mentioned, I co-run our cannabis practice at Burns and Levinson. We've been working with cannabis clients since 2013, mostly on the corporate and finance side, as well as obviously regulatory, because you have to know the regulations in order to do a transaction in any state in this country. And basically our practice is nationwide, but besides representing operators, including some top MSOs, we also represent a lot of banks and credit unions, as well as lenders, venture capital funds, PE funds in this space. So thank you for inviting me and looking forward to the conversation.
Great. Curt, you want to pick up? You want me to go?
Sure, I'll go. So Steve, in the first 20 minutes, we have Professor Mikos telling us a licensed operator, if it got to the point of crossing a state line due to the dormancy clause, may actually be legal. You're in charge of mass licensing. You have I have my lawyer here. It was Burns and Levinson. I want to test this. What would you say if they came to you first with this idea as a licensee in Massachusetts about either importing or exporting cannabis?
First thing I'd say is it's a violation of our regulations. Second of all, I would say as a regulator, I'm not a lawmaker, and my job and the commission's job is to enforce the law. And so if the law changes, or if the law is challenged, or our regulations are challenged, and that's the ruling, we would adhere to it. So I don't really have an opinion on what should happen. Well, I do have a personal opinion. I think it would be a bad idea for the industry in Massachusetts, but legally, as I said, we enforce the law. And right now, our regulations are that you cannot cross state lines, both coming into the state or coming out of the state. And we enforce those regulations.
You just said, though, it'd be a bad idea in your own personal opinion. Do you want to expound on that?
Yeah, I took this job because I really believed in the objectives of the law of Question 4 and the subsequent legislation that created our commission. And if you read that, the legislation was very explicit. They wanted to create a diverse industry. They wanted to create an industry that created room for smaller players. They wanted to create an industry that created room for farming in Massachusetts, particularly small farmers and co-ops. They absolutely wanted to ensure that the industry provided an opportunity for participation by those that were harmed by marijuana prohibition. All those things, in my opinion, would be at risk if interstate commerce was allowed. And I support all of the objectives of the law, as I said a few seconds ago. And interstate commerce, to me, would be deleterious to every one of those specific objectives that was part of the legislation.
And I have to agree with that. I mean, the referendum for one of its primary focuses was establishing this industry for the benefit of those who have been harmed by the war against prohibition, but also for minority social justice, social equity. And, I do think that if the Dormant Commerce Clause were to allow interstate commerce in the cannabis industry, essentially Massachusetts would be flooded by all the cannabis from the Emerald Triangle. And I think that would put a lot of social equity EA applicants who have run their business for a period of time at risk, because they're not going to be able to stand up to the big boys. And I don't necessarily think that that's a good idea as much as I'm a capitalist. I do think that we have a social contract. Referendum 4 is an example of that. And, we do need, I think the state does have a valid reason, whether it's public safety or whatnot, in order to prevent that to happen.
So, I'm sorry, Commissioner, you look.
No, go ahead, David.
No, so I'm going to take an opposing view, and if, as it stands now, it's the larger players in Massachusetts that are vertically integrated, generally speaking, who grow their own, process it, and sell it at retail. Many of the independent retailers tend to be the smaller players. So if you've got a smaller player who now has to compete with the large players who have the full margin, getting interstate commerce would likely hurt the local growers.
Right.
But I think it might actually help the local product manufacturers and local retailers, because it may place them on more equitable footing against some of the bigger growers or the fully integrated growers.
Yeah, I disagree with that, David. I mean, I think I understand your point, and I think there's validity to it. But why I disagree is that, we have Scott's used my line when he said he's a capitalist. I'm a capitalist too, and I believe in competition and free enterprise. And one of the things we've done in Massachusetts is we said we're not going to put caps on the number of licenses we're going to issue. We have caps on the number of licenses any one individual or entity can control, but there are no caps on the total number of licenses. And if you look at the licenses we've issued to date, as well as what's in our licensing queue, there's going to be enormous competition in terms of cultivators competing to sell to manufacturers, manufacturers competing to sell to retailers. I think we have a ton of competition, and we will continue to have more competition in the state that will not allow the big players to dominate the market. I just think it's an efficient market, and there's plenty of room for small players. You did make one point that I absolutely agree with, which is that there's no debate to the fact that farmers and cultivators in Massachusetts would be devastated by interstate commerce. You just can't debate that fact, in my opinion.
And I agree with that. I mean, with respect to the smaller growers in the state, many of them have now taken to sort of the craft beer concept, so the craft cannabis concept. And so they are carving out their own particular niche in order to compete. And I'll agree with the commission. That's capitalism at its best, right? Trying to figure out where you can make the best margin in the business and to adapt and to evolve.
So what I was going to say, David, if I could, you asked, the original question was, what did I think about Professor Mikos' paper? And I just wanted to make a couple other comments again without commenting on the legal argument. One is, he pointed out the Cole memorandum and said that's not a basis, at least not a legal basis to forestall interstate commerce. That might or might not be true, but it's certainly a policy decision that we made and will defend, that we don't want to set our licensees up to be in trouble with the feds. I guess I don't have that's not particularly eloquent. I apologize. But the Cole memorandum was pretty clear on the topic of interstate commerce, and I'll further point out that the Cole memorandum was rescinded, I believe, in 2018 by Jeff Sessions. It was either 2018 or 2019. I think it was 2018. It was rescinded by then Attorney General Sessions. And what Sessions said is, he said, I'm going to let my individual U.S. state attorneys determine what their policy will be with respect to legalized marijuana in the states that have legalized. At that point, U.S. Attorney Lelling, who was the U.S. Attorney of Massachusetts at that point in time, was pushed pretty hard by the industry, including people like David, to say, okay, what are you going to do? And what Lelling articulated was essentially a reinstatement of Cole memorandum. The things that the Cole memorandum prohibited in terms of underage consumption, in terms of criminal money coming into finance businesses, and particularly interstate commerce, all were articulated by Lelling as reasons that he might intervene in the industry. And so we think there's a strong policy reason for listening to the Cole memorandum, even if there's not kind of a legally binding reason to do so, as you argue. There's certainly a good policy reason to do so, in my opinion.
And just piggybacking off that, I agree. May not be the law of the land per se, but don't forget, so FinCEN issued its memorandum in 2014 detailing somewhat how banks and credit unions can take cannabis deposits and deal with the money laundering issue. In that part of that calculus is the Cole memorandum factors, the prosecutorial priorities. So to a certain extent, maybe one could argue that the Cole memorandum isn't necessarily policy of the Department of Justice as a whole, but in terms of the Department of Treasury, it still remains really important with respect to ensuring that money laundering isn't going on. And so it isn't necessarily fully rescinded in totally throughout the country.
Professor, do you want to respond to that? Go ahead. Yep.
Yeah, just a couple of points on background. I mean, one, if you read the Cole memoranda, I don't think it says no interstate commerce, period. I think it raises a concern about where it says diversion across state lines.
Right.
Mhm.
I think what Jim Cole had in mind with that was you're in Colorado and you're shipping it over to Nebraska, a state that doesn't allow it. I think that raises a different set of concerns, and you could see why the DOJ might be interested in intervening in that case. But it's not like a blanket prohibition or a statement against all interstate commerce. I mean,
Right, but also you have to remember, like, let's just take New England, for example, right? So Mass and Maine have adult use and medicinal. Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, New Hampshire have only, Mass and Maine adult use. The other states besides Vermont, medicinal only. Vermont technically has legalized adult use, but not for commercial sales. So, you can't necessarily legally, right, under the Cole memorandum, technically you can't necessarily take adult use cannabis and cross the border to New Hampshire because adult use is not allowed there.
sure, that would be another form, a different form of diversion. I think the bigger problem with relying so much on the DOJ is that the court has repeatedly said, Congress and Congress alone can turn off that anti-discrimination default rule of the Dormant Commerce Clause. So even if the Attorney General tomorrow came out and said, I sanction what you're doing, Massachusetts, I agree with you fully, and discriminate all you want in interstate commerce in not just cannabis, but hey, beer and tobacco and everything else. The DOJ has no power to turn off that Dormant Commerce Clause. So I think that's a more fundamental
Well,
problem.
what the Justice Department does have the ability to do, though, is take a legal business in the state of Massachusetts and say, well, it's in violation of federal law. And it doesn't seem to me to be bad policy. As a matter of fact, I'm sorry for the double neck. It seems to be good policy to do as little to poke the bear as possible. I will also say, my job, as I said, as a regulator, I don't make law, I enforce the law, and I'm a state employee. So my job is to enforce Massachusetts law. The law, this is one of the reasons we came to the conclusion about interstate commerce. The law has a clause in it, which I found amazing when I first started, which is, quote, the commission shall establish separate regulations for Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, period. When I first started, it took me a month or two to figure out what they were talking about. And because they didn't give us any guidance, they just said separate regulations. It turns out, of course, that what they were concerned about is the transport of product across federal water between the mainland and the two islands. And to me, that is a strong indication that the intent of the legislation was to keep this within the state of Massachusetts, to not cross federal boundaries, to not cross state boundaries. Now, again, that we made a policy decision. I will defend the policy decision, but as I said, if a court overrules a policy decision, we'll implement the new laws. But I will absolutely defend the policy decision.
And
I just want to jump in real quick, Scott, and then I'm going to come right back to you. But Bo Whitney has joined us, and he's been sitting there patiently and quietly. So I want to introduce Bo to the audience. Bo Whitney is probably one of the leading economists in the cannabis space. We're thrilled to have him have us. Scott, I'm going to give it back to you, but Bo, feel free to just jump right into the discussion once Scott makes the comment.
I'll just, and because myself and the commission will just go on and on. So please just jump in. But looking at your law review article, Professor, one of the things it did discuss is that perhaps in a carve out, let's say for the Dormant Commerce Clause, is public safety, public health, and there are components of the regulations that do promote that in many different ways. And I'm not just talking about like packaging regulations per se, but, for example, the regulations provide you have to utilize certain lighting for energy conservation. You have to have an energy conservation plan, which is for the public safety because of environmental concerns. It prescribes that you have to have minimum insurance for certain things. I mean, even something like that is certainly something for the public safety. And if you are having product produced elsewhere, stormed into here, perhaps those public safety covenants or provisions in the regs are being tripped. And I mean, those are just a couple that come to mind. I'm sure the commissioner can rattle off like 10 off the top of his head. But it's more than just, people, well, even like the testing, right? So not all states have the same testing requirements for cannabis. Some allow different types of heavy metals. Now, granted, I guess you could come to a uniform set of standards, but that would probably take Congress longer than it would to pass something so simple as to say banking act. So I'll just leave my political commentary there.
I thought the role of CANRA was to establish those state by state common sets of rules, so that when the topic of interstate commerce comes up, then there would be an infrastructure already in place in order to support that. And so, but I haven't seen much results yet out of CANRA in terms of the harmonization of rules and regulations to support cross-border traffic.
I think CANRA is a great organization, and our executive director is part of it. And I think that, it's a wonderful forum for states to learn from one another, share best practice. And so I support it completely. That being said, CANRA is not going to tell the state of Massachusetts what to do with our regulations. We're certainly willing to learn from other states, and to the extent that there's some benefits of getting in line with other states, we'll do so. But I don't view CANRA as an organization that's going to enforce consistency of regulations across states. That's taking away our prerogative, and that I don't believe will happen.
No, I'm not saying CANRA as an enforcement tool, but more as a way in which to educate from state to state and then drive towards harmonization on packaging, on testing, and all these other protocols in preparation in the run-up of either full federal legalization or with some type of interstate commerce pack or what have you.
Yeah, it's possible, and I agree with you. It's a very useful body. You talked about federal legalization, and that was the other thing I would love to hear, Professor, your perspective on, because in your paper you talked about this might all be moot if there's federal legalization. I guess I want to hear a couple of things from you, if you wouldn't mind. One is, they've been talking about federal legalization for a long time. I do not have a crystal ball, but I do see how dysfunctional Congress is, as we all do, I think. So I'm not sure that it's imminent, but let's say it happens. There's, to me, a lot of different ways that it could be legalized. And I don't think it's a lay down that it's just going to become a nationally regulated national market kind of phenomenon. As a matter of fact, I have argued with our state's federal delegation that would be a bad thing. And that another path towards legalization potentially is just tell the states, if you want to do it, do it. Here are the guidelines you have to follow. Do it, but we're not going to interfere, nor are we going to tell you that you have to allow for interstate commerce. Now, again, I have no idea what or if Congress is going to do anything, but I don't think legalization is just, kind of one size fits all. There's a couple of different paths that it could go down. So I'm very interested in your thoughts on that, Professor.
Yeah, one thing I want to get out clearly is that, hopefully it's clear from the papers. I'm worried about interstate commerce.
No, I saw that.
Oh, yes.
A lot of the same reasons. I don't think we want to go down that route, at least in the short term. So I'm kind of, the bringer of bad news, but I'm not the champion of this. I'm not saying, hey, this is
well, can we blame you anyway?
to do it.
And Commissioner Hoffman and I did not. Sorry, go ahead.
But I would say, if there's federal legalization, I wouldn't say this is moot. Instead, I'd say this is settled. You can't enforce those. I mean, you can, but they're going to get shot down by court. All those restrictions on interstate commerce. The moment Congress legalizes, the only way to stop that, the Dormant Commerce Clause, the only way to stop that is through crystal clear congressional legislation that says to the courts, don't apply the Dormant Commerce Clause.
No, I agree with that.
So even something like, there are other ways to do this. I agree. Congress, it's not up to the task. Federal agencies not up to the task of regulating this. You guys at the state have a lot more experience, a lot more regulations on the books. It would take a while for the federal government to sort of catch up. But to turn off that Dormant Commerce Clause, you need very clear language. It wouldn't be enough for Congress to pass something like the States Act. That's another proposal where Congress says federally legal, but states, you handle it. Dormant Commerce Clause would still come in and tell the states, if you allow this, if you allow people to grow and sell it, you can't discriminate because they're based in another state.
No, I get that. By the way, Professor, I do get that you were raising a concern. You weren't advocating. As a matter of fact, you were the opposite. So I respect that and appreciate that. But I think I just heard you say, well, it might be hard. It is doable if the legislation is written correctly. It's doable to enforce a ban on interstate commerce if this was federally legalized. I think I heard you say that. Maybe
Yes.
a long shot, but it's doable.
No, it's doable. And I think there's, I think you can, and to the extent that state regulators help to push in this direction, I think there's a strong case to be made to Congress to turn off this Dormant Commerce Clause, at least for a period of years.
Right.
This transition period. And actually in a piece with Scott Bloomberg, who's a law professor at the University of Maine, we spell out exactly how Congress could do that. There's legislative language you could borrow from insurance. That's a very similar market, it turns out,
Right.
to cannabis. 70 years ago, the Supreme Court threw everyone a curveball. Before that period, before 1945, the Supreme Court said insurance isn't commerce, so it's not subject to the Dormant Commerce Clause. And then the Supreme Court did an about face. Companies started challenging those state laws that said you can't be an out-of-state insurance company and sell insurance here. Created chaos. Congress stepped in, the Karen Ferguson Act, and said, we suspend the Dormant Commerce Clause. That's the language you would need to use. And,
Right.
and no federal proposal right now with this CAOA or the CAOA, Cannabis Opportunity Administration Act. It's hard to get the acronym down. It doesn't have language that would do that. The States Act doesn't have language that would do that. The MORE Act doesn't. I think this has kind of been an oversight, just an accident by Congress. There's so much language in there saying, hey, we want to preserve the states and help them out, but they don't realize that the moment you legalize this federally, you activate this Dormant Commerce Clause and you wreak havoc with the states.
I have a question, Professor. So I totally agree with respect to adult use that, the Dormant Commerce Clause is going to, take down those barriers. Now, my question is, I have no idea what the answer is. I don't know if you've looked into this, but I'm curious, what about the medicinal market? Because to me, that's more pharmaceutical, right? I mean, if it is fully legalized, let's say, I mean, cannabis is a form of medicine for many, many people, including myself. Do you think there's a public safety exception there and how the medicinal market might be treated or governed and whether the Dormant Clause could override that? And again, I don't know the answer. I haven't, just something that came to me as a question.
Yeah, so it's hard. And it goes back to your earlier point that the Dormant Commerce Clause will give a state a chance to justify its regulations. So if Massachusetts can come up with a legitimate reason for discriminating against outsiders, it's not protectionism, it's not saving jobs for locals, even for locals of disproportionately impacted communities. It's not that, it's public health and safety. And if discrimination is absolutely the only way you can do that, the state can win. It can sustain its regulations. It's just really, really tough to do that. The court might say things like, you're worried about testing. Well, apply Massachusetts testing requirements to out-of-state product. Don't just say you can't sell that Oregon stuff here. Just subject it to the same testing. Require them to use, testing that complies with Massachusetts law. That it's just tough once you get into that corner. Once the Dormant Commerce Clause applies, it's tough to justify kind of blatant state restrictions against outsiders.
Let me stoke the fire here and bring Bo in, and I'm gonna poke and prod. I hear a lot of state protectionism talk from Steve and Scott about protecting our farmers, protecting our manufacturers. But at what price to the consumer, Bo? And being an economics guy, I think the price for a pound in Emerald Triangle, $700-800 in Mass indoor is $4,200. And there's your arbitrage of why so many people want this thing to happen. Economically speaking, would it be a boon or a bust for, say, a Massachusetts with these differences? At what price is the consumer paying for this Massachusetts cannabis that now it can't come in and bring the prices down for consumers? What would you think would happen, Bo?
Well, initially the prices would go down, but they're set to go down anyway as markets mature and saturate. It's just how far do they go down? I think by having a national distribution or national supply system, it would actually raise prices coming out of California and Oregon, for example, on the wholesale side, while lowering the prices until there is an established equilibrium. And so I think that's how I view it. I mean, that's why there's a big push in Oregon and California and elsewhere on the West Coast to establish these trade relations with the East Coast, because it gives a market opportunity that they don't currently have. Now, in California and Oregon right now, there's a supply surplus. So I would tend to disagree with the unlimited license hypothesis that was presented earlier, because in these siloed markets, there's only so much demand, and until it's not economically viable. But once you open up that market and open it up to the entire domestic demand in the US, then that risk of saturation and further price declines, commoditization, et cetera, doesn't necessarily exist as much unless you start licensing in Massachusetts to support the US market, and then New Jersey licenses on the cultivation side to supply the entire market. That's when there becomes these market distortions. But overall, it would be good for consumers because of lower prices. There would be an increase of demand because of the demand elasticity. It would also, with lower prices, would drive out and be more competitive relative to illicit market. So you'd be able to convert more consumers over to the legal market relative to the illicit market. And so that's where the public safety factor comes in as well. So you've got a lot of benefits associated with opening up interstate commerce to cannabis suppliers, especially from west to east.
So I guess the roll-off question to Scott and Steve would be, and Professor mentioned this earlier in the show, avocados, oranges from other states. Why do we have to protect the cannabis farmer as opposed to our apple farmers when we import apples, if we do get legalization? Why the barrier? You sound like capitalists, but state-centric capitalists, not full-on capitalists. So go ahead.
Go ahead, Scott, if you want to go first. I'm happy to go first. I was being polite, I was not
Okay.
trying to dodge the question. I was being polite, which I know is out of character. So.
Oh, go ahead. You want to go?
I think Massachusetts has some specific policy objectives that are certainly subject to debate, but there are specific policy objectives. They are trying to encourage small cultivators, particularly outdoor cultivation. I respect that. You can disagree with that as an objective, but I respect that. It's a very explicit objective of the law. I think that as much as the law is focused on farming, though, there are other objectives as well that would be substantially threatened by interstate commerce, and those are really important. I mean, the idea that, again, people that were harmed by marijuana prohibition can be full participants in this industry. We're doing everything we can to help those people get into the industry, and I'm very proud of the progress we've made, although we have a long ways to go. But they're struggling. They're having a hard time raising capital. They're having a hard time getting through the municipal bureaucracy to get a host community agreement assigned before they can even apply to my commission for a license. Those are in my opinion, those are worthwhile social objectives. And we have cultivated or developed a set of regulations that are, unashamedly, explicitly attempting to incent those outcomes. I support those outcomes personally. I guess I said I wouldn't have taken this job had I not, or did I not? And that's the way we built our regulations. People can absolutely disagree with policy. I mean, look, I've lived for 4 years with the fact that question 4 passed by 53% in favor, 47% opposed. There's a significant percentage of the state that doesn't like the law, some because they don't like marijuana, some because of the concerns like you raised, Curt. That's democracy. The law is the law. My job is to uphold the law. And as I said, I would not take this job or would not have taken this job unless I supported the objectives of the law. And I think the intended outcomes are desirable.
And just to kind of coincide with that, I mean, the war against marijuana started, it has its roots in racism. I mean, that's a fact. And to the extent, if the national legislation that legalized the end of prohibition, descheduled, whatever we're going to do, also had a component in which, social equity, social justice, whatever you want to, EA, economic empowerment, if that was a consistently implemented across the country, then, maybe I would have a different perspective of the state's rights and the state's needs. But, the referendum, I mean, again, referendum 4 did specifically carve out this necessity, right, for making sure the industry was available and there were certain benefits given to people who were affected by the war on drugs or marijuana. And so to me, that's the distinction with pure capitalism.
Professor, what do you think of that? I use the apple example. We grow apples here in Massachusetts. We import them as well. Where does social equity and economic empowerment candidates fit in the dormancy clause if this kind of moves forward? Can a state say, hey, look, those higher prices and things you're seeing are necessary for these applicants and what we're building and in our referendums and our laws?
Yeah, it would be an argument I'd urge Stephen to push to a court if challenged on this. I don't know if it would win though. The social equity applicants or social equity licensees, they're really the ones who are going to be hit hardest, I think, interstate commerce. In part because this national market in interstate commerce is going to invite a lot of consolidation in the industry. So now you're going to be the minority-owned businesses are going to be less well capitalized, even with access to banking compared to a lot of other firms. It's going to be an uphill battle against the behemoths, and I doubt they'd survive. But they're going to be hit in another way. And one of the things some states have done is they've tried to carve out a special set of licenses. They restrict the number of licenses. They'll say, here are some that we're going to designate for these communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. They can't award them based on race because that would violate the Equal Protection Clause. Instead, what they've done is they've awarded these based on geography. They said, here are some communities in our state where the arrest rates were 5 times higher than they were in other states. And we're going to give residents from these communities more of these special licenses. You can't do that if you can't discriminate based on geography. And so that class of licensing, I think, is going to dry up. Maybe you can tell a court, hey, we've got a special reason for doing this. This community was disproportionately impacted. I don't know if the court would buy that, though.
We've given those licenses, as you know, Professor, we've given exclusivity to social equity and economic empowerment applicants for several categories of licenses, delivery, as well as social consumption. Although social consumption, unfortunately, is still a theory until there's a way for cities and towns to opt in. But nonetheless, your point about geography, I understand. What we've done is we've said there are multiple criteria that you need to meet. You don't need to meet all of them. You need to meet 2 out of 4. One of those 4 criteria is, residency in disproportionately impacted areas. Others have to do with things like historical arrests in your family or yourself, income. So we've tried to make it so it's not purely discrimination based upon geography. There are other, what we think are strong policy reasons that we've set criteria up. What's your thought on that? Because again, geography is one criteria, but you can actually meet the other two of the other 3 criteria that have nothing to do with geography and still qualify for one of these licenses.
It's smart to have that, I think, as sort of an addendum or additional criteria. I think a court would probably still say, going forward, if a court said the Dormant Commerce Clause applies, you can't use geography at all. Or maybe what you have to do is you have to say, all right, we'll accept applicants who live in communities in other states that meet the same criteria. which maybe that's not appealing to Massachusetts. Maybe you don't want to be giving out these licenses to
No,
some
I'm laughing just because
Idaho, you know.
one of the other things the legislature did to us is say we had to ensure that, people from disproportionately impacted communities were full participants in the industry. They did not define what a disproportionately impacted community was.
Yeah.
We've gone through several rounds of analysis to try to define that. And I'm just smiling because God knows if other states have to go through the process as well.
Oh yeah. There's oftentimes those tough questions are foisted onto the regulators rather than taken on by the lawmakers. But you could continue to use those other criteria, but it might mean, hey, did you have a family member who was arrested in the past?
Right. Well, that's one of the criteria.
Right.
But it may be, all right, I'm from Idaho and I had a family member who was
No,
arrested.
I understand your point.
Where's my license?
I don't wish this
Yeah.
definitional issue of what constitutes disproportionately impacted community on any other state. That's all.
Yeah. Fair enough.
I'm going to jump in, folks. It's 5 o'clock. We got to take our top of the hour break. Stick with us. We're going to be right back here in the Green Rush.
So I think there's one very important difference between me and most of my team members and other cannabis accounting firms, especially outsourced cannabis accounting firms. With a lot of the other firms, you're going to find bookkeepers or folks that were accountants for their entire career, but they were junior accountants. I've spent most of my career alongside CFOs at public companies with thousands of employees, public companies. So much of my career wasn't spent in the debits and credits. It was spent with the CFO, CEO, COO of large public companies, working on strategy, working on planning and big initiatives, working on projects such as mergers and integrations. So that high level experience, along with being able to do the debits and credits and having members of my team that also have fairly senior experience and also members of the team that are junior and can do the bookkeeping at a little bit lower cost than some of the people with the experience, gives our clients a much broader depth of experience than a lot of the other firms where you're hiring someone that is just a bookkeeper and can't help with the strategy side of it, or someone that's been an executive for a long time and can only help with the strategy but can't help with the hands-on.
Pro Cannabis Media Programming and PCM TV is supported by Revolutionary Clinics, Massachusetts' #1 medical dispensary where the patient comes first, and by Salient Systems for Video Surveillance. You've got regulations, Salient has solutions for your security needs. And by Accounting Buds, your #1 CPA specialist for the cannabis industry. And by Artery Pay, easy, cheap, fun, and legal, just like cannabis should be.
Difference is building a solution for that individual, not just a custom, here's a box, here's a video, here's how you make your VMS. We custom design and custom build every situation for exactly what the customer needs. And we keep the costs low. We have multiple tiers, as far as what you're looking at on the cost side of things. If you want a one-time, where you just pay one initial cost, we have that. If you want to maintain your system and have the highest protection and highest capabilities and highest upgrades at all times, we have different plans for you. But we scale it so it's scalable and affordable 100%.